As Godly Heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. Now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View. Going to spend some time talking about the Federal Reserve. We'll also be talking about whether mail-in ballots are something that can be controlled even from the presidency. Next hour, we'll be talking with Dr. Tanita Maddox, and her book is entitled What Gen Z Really Wants to Know About God. But we need to start with, of course, one of these very sad stories that happens from time to time, and that is shooting broke out this morning in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the Annunciation Catholic Church. Already 2 children are dead, 17 others wounded, when a gunman opened fire inside a Catholic church in Minneapolis. As a matter of fact, according to what we know here, some of the shooting took place through the windows. The 2 children, ages 8 and 10, who were killed, were shot through the window. This has been a tragedy that everybody has been speaking to. President Donald Trump said on Truth Social, "I've been fully briefed on the tragic shooting in Minneapolis, Minnesota." The FBI quickly responded, and they are there on the scene. The White House will continue to monitor this terrible situation. Please join me in praying for everyone involved. Kristi Noem, of course, is the Secretary of Homeland Security. She said, "We're in communication with our interagency partners. We'll share more information." And she says, "I'm praying for the victims of this heinous attack and their families." But as you might imagine, there have been some that have been even criticizing the idea of praying for those individuals. The Mayor Jacob Fry, said, "You cannot put into words the gravity, tragedy, or pain of this situation. And don't just say it's about thoughts and prayers." These kids were literally praying. These are kids who should be learning with their friends. They should be playing on the playground. They should be able to go to a school or church in peace. Very true. We need to figure out what we can do to protect children, whether they're in the public schools or, in this case, a parochial school. And it is certainly one that we will be talking about in the future. And, of course, you know there will be all sorts of statements being made even before these children are buried about gun control and guns and Second Amendment and psychological issues and all the rest. But I did want to at least mention that today. It's a sad way to start our Wednesday program, but it's nevertheless part of the news cycle as well, and we will continue to talk about those kinds of issues here on Point of View. But I did want to see if we could educate ourselves just a little bit on this issue of the Federal Reserve. And there's a very good reason for that. First of all, as you have noticed, and we've talked about this before, there has been quite a pushback back and forth between President Donald Trump and Jerome Powell, who, of course, is the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Number two, there has now been the argument that the president can and has fired Lisa Cook, who is one of the individuals on the board of the Federal Reserve. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And this also brings us to a bigger issue, which is one of the reasons why I recommend the other day, and now we are going to have an actual Outlook article, series of articles coming out, an entire issue on the Federal Reserve. That won't be coming out for a couple of months, but just as we oftentimes encourage you to support Point of View, that's one of the benefits of supporting Point of View. You receive the Outlook magazine, and we will go into, and already have gone into, some detail about that. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But my first article from Jim Garrity, Trump and the Federal Reserve, and the argument that he makes that he can fire Lisa Cook. And Lisa Cook is a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. She contends that President does not have the authority to fire her. And this really goes back to the founding of the Federal Reserve, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. But the legal issue goes back to 1935. And that is, the Supreme Court ruled in that particular case, given the fact that the Federal Reserve, as I like to say, is neither federal and has doubtful reserves. It really is, and it's interesting to see some of these articles being written about talking about an independent federal agency. Well, it's more independent than even, say, the SEC or the FTC or FCC or something like that, but we'll get into it. But the Supreme Court did rule in 1935 that indeed, if there is an independent agency, and this could be any of these agencies, that you could indeed fire an individual for cause, though there is no, as we would acknowledge, uniform definition. But certainly it would be where somebody has failed to actually enact certain kinds of policies, failed in one way or another. Maybe there's a breach of fiduciary duty or whatever. And so we have a more recent case in which the Supreme Court's majority upheld Donald Trump's right to fire members of some of these boards. That, in the particular case, had to do with the Labor Relations Board, but nevertheless, that was the case. But even in making the argument, the Supreme Court justices said the Federal Reserve is a little different because the Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of first and second banks of the United States. This, I think, was interpreted to say you may have the opportunity and you even may have the authority to fire somebody on the National Labor Relations Board or somebody at the FCC or the FTC or whatever, but you really don't have that same kind of authority when it comes to the Federal Reserve. And so the argument being made by the president is that Lisa Cook signed a document and in one case claimed property as her primary residence in Michigan, and then later claimed property in Georgia as her primary residence. By the way, this is something which unfortunately some of our elitists have done for a long time. Matter of fact, she may be thinking, what? I mean, this is the kind of stuff we all do because, after all, we're above the law. And, of course, he's using that as a justification. I don't know that he will win in court, but I'm not going to make any real predictions because how many times have we seen some things unexpected taking place? It is worth mentioning real quickly that Lisa Cook was actually placed there because Joe Biden wanted to, as he said, put the first black woman on the board of the Federal Reserve. And as many people have pointed out, but let me just quote from the editors of National Review, Lisa Cook was poorly qualified for the Fed in the first place. She is an accomplished economist, but she had no financial industry experience. Her research wasn't about monetary policy, and there are all sorts of other questions we could raise. But again, this, I think, is always one of the things that I think has harmed our African Americans in America, because ever since we've had affirmative action and now DEI, an individual that's in a position, you sometimes wonder, are they there because they are the most qualified, or are they there because we want to check a box? In two separate cases, President Biden made it very clear, I'm checking boxes. Supreme Court nominee, and in this case, a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. Anyway, I want to come back real quickly and give us kind of a brief understanding of the Federal Reserve. I have found that most people don't understand too much about it, and maybe that helps you understand why, even though the Supreme Court said, yes, you do have authority over some of these independent agencies, the Federal Reserve is very different, and you have to know how it was formed in the first place. So we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
President Trump has been promoting the positive impact of his tariffs, while his critics argue that ultimately Americans will be paying the price for his tariffs. The editors of the Wall Street Journal point to inflation data to argue that American households will be paying. However, they acknowledge that an increase in consumer prices hasn't shown up yet, perhaps because companies have large cash reserves. Tim Carney argues that if you dig into the data, the question of who pays the tariffs becomes more complicated. If Walmart buys 100 rubber footballs from China, Walmart will pay Customs and Border Patrol. You would assume they would pass the increased cost on to their consumers. But China may not be the only source of footballs. There might be U.S. and Mexican football factories. If China is the only country making these footballs, the demand is what economists call inelastic. But if there are other sources of footballs, then demand is elastic. There's also the political component. President Trump told Walmart to eat the tariffs. It is likely that they indeed might have done this in many cases. After all, if you increase the cost of rubber footballs too much, consumers might decide to buy American-made leather footballs, or U.S. consumers might decide to keep throwing their old rubber football a little longer. On the positive side, tariff threats have changed the markets in ways that have helped consumers and encouraged U.S. investment in this country. But making rubber footballs in the U.S. will always be more expensive than making them in China. On the negative side, tariffs can trigger trade wars, and we've seen retaliation and other economic threats. As you can see, who pays the tariffs is more complicated than you might imagine. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of intelligent design, go to viewpoints.info/intelligent design. Viewpoints.info/intelligent design. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's do, if we can, just kind of a short teaching on the Federal Reserve. We'll come back to it again tomorrow. One of the articles I've posted for our Thursday program is about Jerome Powell, tariffs, and inflation. But if you want to understand the importance and even the power of the Federal Reserve, just notice that when Jerome Powell is up there in, of all places, Wyoming, because every year they go up there in August, in Jackson Hole, people were waiting really with bated breath to see what he was going to say. We also have, of course, the group that is coming together very soon, which is going to determine what the interest rates will be. And this is one of those issues that when the chairman of the Federal Reserve speaks, banks wait on it, investors wait on it, businesses wait on it, and consumers wait on it. And, of course, it is also the source of a fair amount of inflation. Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, said, "We have the ability to create money digitally, and we do that by buying treasury bills or bonds or other government guarantee securities, and actually it increases the money supply." He was willing in that case to admit that, and of course there have been all sorts of other individuals that over the years have made the same argument that we are no longer on the gold standard. We no longer have to be quite so concerned about that. Some of the things even established during the 1944 Bretton Woods system are really different. And so you got Neil Kashkari saying there's really an infinite amount of cash at the Federal Reserve. We will do whatever we need to do to make sure there's enough cash in the banking system. So we'll talk more about this issue of inflation. But I thought for just a minute, some people might say, well, Donald Trump is president over the federal government, and the Federal Reserve is part of the federal government, so he should have the right to remove an individual. But then you have to understand that the Federal Reserve is not under the federal government. You really have to go back to the book that Marlon Maddox did an interview on back in the 1990s. Every once in a while I run into somebody who said, you ever heard of the book Creature from Jekyll Island? I said, oh, yes, we were doing interviews back when you were in diapers on that particular book. But nevertheless, when that book came out in the 1990s, many listeners for the first time we're learning about the history of the Federal Reserve. And interesting enough, Edward Griffin, who wrote the book, starts it with this: the secret meeting on Jekyll Island in Georgia at which the Federal Reserve was conceived, the birth of a banking cartel to protect its members from competition, the strategy of how to convince Congress and the public that this cartel was an agency of the United States government. If you don't know the story, I'm going to give you the short version of it, but we cover it, of course, in an upcoming issue of Outlook. And that is, at that time, Senator Nelson Aldrich gathered members from the biggest banks in America on a private railway car and then secretly traveled to Georgia. Then they rode a chartered boat to one of these sea islands, and it's Jekyll Island. And there they strategized during the week, planned what today is the Federal Reserve. Now, there have been a lot of people that for a while denied the existence of that, but the bottom line is we've got lots of evidence of it, probably the best coming from the future founder of Forbes magazine, BC Forbes. Of course, we've had Stephen Forbes on here, and he wrote about this a couple of years later. He said, picture a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York on a private railway car under the cover of darkness, stealthily going quickly hundreds of miles to the south, embarking on a mysterious launch, sneaking onto an island deserted by all but a few servants, living there a full week under rigid security, so much so that the names of not one of those individuals at that island was mentioned, lest the servants learn the identity and disclose to the world the strangest and most secret expedition in the history of American finance. And so, again, you can read the book, and we're going to spend some time talking about it, especially as the Outlook magazine comes out. But that was then the origin of the Federal Reserve. Then, of course, it was actually implemented in 1913. And the justification at the time was, well, we've had some of these financial panics. We had the Panic of 1907. And so as a result, we will now allow the Federal Reserve to begin to control all sorts of issues. I think the goal there was to prevent competition from some of the other banks and to put as much power in the hands of these bankers. As a matter of fact, even though, interestingly enough, they have 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, most of the power to this day is still in the New York Bank, and you can kind of learn that as well. And the idea was to make it look like it's part of the federal government, hence the word federal, but at the same time recognize it was operating completely independent from the government. And really the only way the president has any kind of authority, at least constitutionally or even in terms of various Supreme Court decisions, is to hire the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And, of course, you've seen the back and forth there. You've had, of course, the Federal Reserve Reform Act in 1977, which established its dual mandate, sustainable employment and maintaining price stability and all the rest. And, of course, you have what is called the FOMC. That is the Federal Open Market Committee, meets every 6 weeks, going to meet here in September, to set interest rates. And you can, if nothing else, see why many guests that have been on this program over the years have said perhaps the most powerful men in the world are the individuals that are on the Federal Reserve, and the most powerful man of all is the chairman of the Federal Reserve. If nothing else, let me wind down with this, because former member of Congress Ron Paul, father of Rand Paul, of course, wrote a book called End the Fed. And I love how he says it in his book. He says, in the United States, the creation of the Federal Reserve fundamentally altered the balance of power in our democratic system. Votes, campaign promises, polls, public opinion laws, restrictions on the states, all of these forces took a back seat to the goals of the government to expand. He says, imagine an irresponsible teenager with an unlimited line of credit. The parents, teachers, pastors, and authorities are ultimately powerless to change his habits. Now imagine that teenager armed to the teeth, but also immune from even the rule of law, and that is what you have with a government backed by a central bank. So we're going to continue to see the push back and forth between the president and the Federal Reserve, and the latest incident, of course, has to do with this particular issue of whether or not one of the members of the Board of Governors can be fired by the president. I suspect the president will lose that battle, but you just never can predict what's going to happen in this upside-down world that we find ourselves in as well. Just before we take a break, let me point real quickly to the second article, which I won't talk much about today. It's something we will probably cover a lot more on our Friday weekend edition. But just as the president has talked about and actually implemented federal agents and others into Washington, D.C., now he's starting to talk about the possibility of whether or not Chicago is next. And again, it's kind of an interesting series of discussions. I give you some quotes from Carl Cannon saying Democrats will tell you it's all grandstanding, that Trump doesn't care about crime, that he's just trying to make Democrats look bad. But he raises the question, is this really about a broader issue? These states and cities have declared themselves sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. What they mean is police departments do not cooperate with ICE, even in cases where immigrants are charged or even convicted of serious crimes. So we'll see whether or not this is implemented in Chicago. One of the other places in Maryland, the governor, Wes Moore, has made it very quick to argue that he is not going to allow the President of the United States to come into Maryland, and especially in Baltimore, but we'll see. Again, Carl Cannon says what's interesting is how quickly this got out of hand. The Democratic governor, Wes Moore, prides himself on being civil, but he sent a letter to Trump saying, before you call our city a hellhole, that was his word, why don't you come here on a walking tour? And so some of this is getting to be a little bit more nasty. So we will certainly look at this more on Friday, because there is the argument being made that if indeed you're not going to allow federal agents onto your property, whether it's your state or your city, and you are certainly going to have crime out of control, we've got to do something. And as I mentioned yesterday, but it's a very good argument, we have the world coming to us next year, one, because of our 250th anniversary, but more importantly, because we'll have the World Cup. And I guarantee you, if we have people from other countries getting mugged on the streets of whether it's Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Houston, Dallas, Seattle, San Francisco, wherever it might be, we're going to be dealing with bigger issues than whether or not we could actually have the National Guard come into a city and prevent any more crimes from taking place. We'll be back right after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
I mentioned that next hour we're going to be spending some time talking about this new book, What Gen Z Really Wants to Know About God. We, of course, talk about our Next Generation Roundtable. I think you will benefit from some of this conversation that we're going to have with Dr. Tanita Maddox, who is an individual with Young Life and has written this book with InterVarsity Press. I think you will appreciate that as well. One of my other articles has to do with mail-in voting. And again, I want to try to provide some history. Just as a minute ago, I wanted you to understand that this whole question about the Federal Reserve really needs to even go back to its founding in 1913. This issue of mail-in voting needs to be put in some context as well. A number of years ago, a number of decades ago, probably more accurate, you had James Baker and Jimmy Carter, who were head of what was called the Commission of Federal Election Reform. Now, James Baker had served under Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter, of course, had been president of the United States. And yet you had a Republican and a Democrat put together this commission on federal election reform. They posted their material, and then they traveled around to many other countries and gave them, if you will, their recommendations for what would be best practices. If you go back and look at that commission report, number one on the list was absentee voting and mail-in ballots are the greatest possibility for election fraud. So with that as a background, I might point out that Jimmy Carter a little bit later kind of changed his mind on that a little bit. But again, you've had all sorts of states that have said, we just want to make it really easy. For those of you that are younger listeners, it used to be that you would vote the way many of us still do vote, and that is you would go to the polling place on Election Day and you would vote. And sometimes the lines were long and sometimes people were frustrated, but it was the easiest way to avoid any kind of election fraud. And so with that as background, let me now mention something else that President Trump has done, and that is, actually, he's only planned to do it, but nevertheless, he announced on Truth Social that it was his intention to sign an executive order banning mail-in voting ahead of the 2026 election. I just told you a minute ago that I think his ability to remove somebody from the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve is probably going to lose. This one, by definition, will, because the issue of voting is put in the hands of the state. We didn't like it when Joe Biden wanted to try to nationalize elections. Don't like it any better when Donald Trump is trying to nationalize elections. But there, I think, with this particular executive order, might be a way to provide some encouragement, maybe a carrot or a stick, because ultimately we still leave it to the states to determine how voting will take place. But the reality is, as this article points out, which appeared in the Federalist by Josh Finley, who, by the way, is an individual that has been researching this for some time with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, he says the reality is that mail-in voting is the least secure method of casting a ballot in the United States. Unlike in-person voting, where safeguards such as voter ID verification are standard and supported by a majority of the people, mail-in ballots are susceptible to fraud, misdelivery, and errors. Yet, nevertheless, states have widely implemented this: California, Nevada, Colorado. But again, once they've done so, I've also experienced chronic delays in counting ballots, sometimes taking days or even weeks to finalize the results. He gives a couple of examples. I'll give you one or two. California took 38 days after the November election to certify the results, with about 81% of the votes being by mail. In Nevada, mail ballots sent in Election Day still could be counted if they arrived up to 4 days afterward, a rule that extended the timeline for the final results in 2020. Colorado's faced other problems as well. And now you have other states where they're more background states. It's one thing when you sort of know how California is going to vote in terms of both the presidential election and the senatorial elections, pretty much have a pretty good idea where Colorado is going to vote. Nevada is a swing state, or was. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin are all thinking about this as well, and they've encountered significant challenges with mail-in voting. In Pennsylvania, last-minute changes and a surge in mail-in voting during the 2020 election caused extended deadlines and legal challenges and all the rest. And so all of that, even just for trying to make it efficient. But then, as you go a little further in this article, one of the things that is really addressed by Josh Finley is he says Democrats have increasingly weaponized mail-in voting as a tool to influence election outcomes. By pushing expansive mail-in voting programs without sufficient safeguards, they have created opportunities for procedural confusion, ballot mishandling, and in some cases or instance, outright fraud. One of the arguments that used to be against all of this was we don't have that many people being prosecuted for voter fraud, and you have noticed that at least in some of the red states, attorneys general have begun to institute that and do what they can to prosecute some of that fraud as nothing else, a deterrent, but also as a reality that that argument will immediately evaporate or vanish simply because they aren't going to be able to argue in the future that when you're trying to get rid of mail-in ballots, trying to implement a solution for which there is no problem. The last 2 points that he makes, I think, are really key. He says the case for banning mail-in voting is clear. Elections must be secure, transparent, and fair. When convenience is important, it can never come at the expense of integrity. In-person voting with proper identification and procedural safeguards ensures every vote is legitimate, every voter is verified, and the results are beyond reproach. So again, he points out that President Trump's executive order would be a bold step toward restoring confidence in our elections. By taking action to ban mail-in voting, he would not only protect the integrity of the vote, but also send a clear message. That is, that election integrity matters. Americans deserve to know that when they cast their ballot, it will be counted accurately and fairly without interference, delay, or doubt. So again, you can read the piece. Again, don't want to necessarily criticize what he is talking about, because I know that he believes that this would be a very significant change that would certainly improve election integrity. But there is no way the President of the United States, especially given what is written in the Constitution, can wave his wand and say now everybody has to ban mail-in ballots. But we'll wait till the executive order comes out. Maybe there's something we're missing here, or maybe there will be a carrot and a stick which says if you get to the point where you have a more voter integrity system, we will certainly reward you, or if you don't, we will punish you. We'll see what he actually puts forward. But again, there is a small issue, not a small one at all, the Constitution of the United States that puts that in the hands of individuals in the various states. And I think that is, the most appropriate way to address it for now. Let's take a break, but just before we do so, let me mention my commentary today is paying tariffs. And one of the things that you're seeing more and more is the argument that Americans as taxpayers are paying for all the tariffs. I try to take you through a little bit more complex understanding of that, because one of the illustrations that I quote from Tim Carney is just imagine Walmart's going to buy 100 rubber footballs from China. Well, then, okay, who pays that, China or Walmart? But let's also recognize that China may not be the only source of footballs. There may be a U.S. manufacturer. There may be a Mexican football manufacturer. And so as a result, if they are the only country, well, then that's what economists call inelastic. But if there are other sources of footballs, that tariff might actually cause Walmart to buy them somewhere else. But then you have a whole series of other things, because Donald Trump told Walmart to eat the tariffs, and maybe they did. So it's possible that Walmart paid for it. It's also possible China paid for it. It's also possible that the tariffs were not making any significant impact on the price of those rubber footballs. And then, of course, you have the other thing, the consumers, because some Americans might look at that and say, the cost of rubber footballs is too much. Maybe I should just go buy an American-made leather football. Or maybe I should decide to keep my old rubber football and not buy a new one. You can see that as soon as you get into this, we have a market system. Hundreds of thousands of decisions are made every year by consumers, by importers, by exporters, by manufacturers. And so this waving of the wand saying that taxpayers will always pay the tariffs, it's not even close to that simple. And I thought, if nothing else, it was worth taking you down a little bit of an economics rabbit hole to teach you a little bit more about economics and who pays the tariffs. It's not as easy as you might think. That's why I posted the article for you to read and maybe pass on to others that are convinced the tariff is raising our taxes. Not necessarily. Let's take a break. We got more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
I'm going to end this hour by talking about artificial intelligence, and there's a couple reasons why. First of all, it shows up in the news with great regularity. I might point you to my commentary on August 20th about AI and jobs. I might alert you to the fact that my commentary on AI and humanity will be actually on the website on Friday, August 29th. But there's a couple of other reasons. First of all, everybody's writing about it, but there's very good reason. There are a number of people, both in the investment world and in the tech world, that are saying AI will be the most disruptive technology of our lifetime. So disruptive that I saw one of the investors the other day was asking where they were going to put their funds, and they said in AI, and they said more specifically where, and they said Tesla. And you will, if you go and look at my commentary that comes out on Friday, see that Tesla has, of course, Optimus, which is the AI-powered humanoid robot, which I talk about. Of course, Tesla already has self-driving robo-taxis. One of these investors said that's exactly what she was going to buy. They're talking about also having some that are actually flying. How that works out with the FAA, we'll have to figure out as well. Of course, Elon Musk also has developed what is called Neuralink. So AI is going to be and is already very disruptive, which leads us to this article by William Galston. You might say, who is he? William Galston is a very prominent Democrat. I always like to quote some individuals that may, in some ways, disagree with some of the things we talk about around the table. He was the deputy advisor for domestic policy under President Bill Clinton. And William Galston says, should we believe the AI doomsayers? And I think it's a very well-written piece because on the one hand, he says that with the rise of artificial intelligence, fears of its possible negative effects have matched sky-high hopes for its potential. Some AI theorists even warn that it could lead to the destruction of humanity. Should we believe them? Now, he talks about the fact that there are some interesting gatherings, and those oftentimes take place, you knew it, in Berkeley, California. This group, which are referred to as rationalists, are ones that get together and they focus on mathematics, genetics, philosophy, and AI. Hence, the first chapter in my newest book is on transhumanism, because I recognize that we're seeing artificial intelligence, genetics, genetic engineering, all sorts of things coming together. And they discuss a variety of different issues, including some of the writings of one individual that I quote in our booklet, A Biblical Point of View on artificial intelligence, who has been concerned about the fact that, well, even though he has been working in the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, is still very concerned. He says that on the one hand, AI can deliver a better life if it doesn't destroy humanity first. Okay, so that's pretty much the double-edged sword we're talking about here. Goes on to say in this article, but AI developers have focused more on developing artificial general intelligence, that's called AGI, AI that hypothetically could reach or surpass human-level intelligence, and that's where you've seen some of the greatest fears. In one article, interestingly enough, AGI Ruin, a list of lethalities, this article was concerned about what could be as referred to as the misalignment, the idea that AGI could develop goals and activities at odds with those of its creators. In other words, thinking, well, we have gotten so advanced as machines, we don't even need human beings anymore. And again, that is the Terminator scenario, the Matrix scenario, one we've certainly seen in a lot of science fiction films. But intensifying this threat is the possibility of rapid self-generated gains in capability that even outpace our ability as human beings to control them. In a Time magazine article 2 years ago, he was, of course, listed as one of the more influential people. But again, one of the other authors of that article, if anyone builds it, everyone dies. So again, you can see that there are some real concerns about that. But He says AI should not be, and some of the dangers should not be disregarded, but at the same time, we shouldn't necessarily assume that we are headed for a dystopia for which we have no control. He says we do have to recognize that there are times when AI has not provided the accurate information we expected from it. Sometimes it goes into a delusional spiral. We've talked about some of the hallucinations it gets into as well. And so in a recent op-ed, the former CEO of Google, that would be Eric Schmidt, and another individual note that Silicon Valley's fascination with AGI goes all the way back to the 1950s. And that goes back to an individual that you may have seen portrayed in a film, Alan Turing, because you, of course, have the so-called Turing test. I can leave that to, as a matter of fact, my producer, who's done some of those computer acting issues as well. But the Turing test would be that could we possibly create a machine that looks so much like a human being we couldn't tell the difference. And when you've seen some of these robots, you see some of the responses from these chatbots, you can see that if we're not there, we're very close. So one of the things he ends with is recognizing that we need to think deeply about this issue. 3 cheers for a prominent Democrat who used to be in the Clinton administration for talking about that. He talks about the AI Futures Project, which released a report this year predicting that AI could achieve superhuman intelligence by 2030. So we got about 4 years left, guys. And so as a result, wanted to explore scenarios as to what might unfold. So again, he argues that we may be walking down a fairly narrow path, but at the same time, we will certainly pursue AI, and AI is going to be the most disruptive technology we can possibly imagine. But at the same time, got to pay attention to its dangers. One of the other great concerns about AI is you never know what is true. And that was illustrated just the other day because, as you may have heard by now, I suspect, there was this engagement between Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. If that's news to you, well, you've been out of the news cycle. But the point I want to focus on is a man by the name of Matthew Pittman. Dr. Matthew Pittman is an associate professor at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. And he filmed, and I watched it the other day, a viral comedy skit reacting to Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce's engagement news. Now, it is a joke. It was a skit, but he was in this skit standing before the students, canceling a scheduled biochemistry midterm to the excitement of the students, and said it's going to be everywhere for a long time, and sort of drawing comparisons to the news and a royal wedding and all the rest. And so as a result, you see kids fist pumping, throwing on their backpacks and running out of the class. And it was all a joke. The sad reality is a lot of people didn't get that it was a joke. And the reason I think it illustrates that is the same problem that the Babylon Bee has. Babylon Bee people, if you talk to any of them, say, we do these satires, but the trouble is, so many times the satires become real. You can remember a few years ago that when we had some of these racial conflicts, there were individuals actually excusing students from taking finals, even from being able to go to class. And so here it is, a joke, a viral video pretending to cancel a biochemistry midterm goes viral, and a lot of people believe that it is true. It illustrates once again why we say you need to have some discernment even when you're watching one of those videos. We'll be right back.
Let me ask you something, if I may. Have you been blessed by Point of View? We often hear from listeners about the positive impact that Point of View has in their lives. As one listener told us, Point of View leaves me informed and encouraged. So this may surprise you. Out of all the Point of View's hundreds of thousands of listeners, just 1% supports the program. And yet Point of View relies on listener donations. If every listener gave just $10, Point of View's full ministry and operations would be funded for an entire year. Let me ask you again. Have you been blessed by Point of View? I urge you, pay it forward today with a $10 donation so others may be blessed as well. Give online at pointofview.net. Or you can call us and give toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about Generation Z. And you know that many, many years ago, we finally decided that it was time to address some of these issues of the younger generation. So we put together at the time what was called the Millennial Roundtable. And at first I was hosting it, and then eventually we turned it over to people that were millennials. And to this day, we have still what now is called the Next Generation Roundtable, because we recognize that we have Generation Y, Generation Z, and even starting to talk about Generation Alpha. This is a topic that we have addressed in the past. Thomas Rayner was on the program with us the other day. We talked about his book, The Anxious Generation Goes to Church, what the research says about what younger generations need and want from your church. And he again took the title Anxious Generation from the book by Jonathan Haidt. But we want to now come to a book that will be out shortly, which has the title, What Gen Z Really Wants to Know About God, 7 Questions About Life and Faith. It is written by Dr. Tanita Maddox. She has her doctorate from Phoenix Seminary. She is the National Director for Generational Impact for Young Life, also works and serves as the Associate Regional Director in the Mountain West Young Life Program and region, and she is also involved in being interviewed on a variety of different topics. She's been featured on the Holy Post podcast, been published in the Great Commission Research Journal. This book coming out shortly, and if you wanted to pre-order it, we have information about it on our website, published by InterVarsity Press. Dr. Maddox, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Wow, that was a mouthful. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Well, I'll call you Tanita, but I just thought I'd at least give you the credit for the work that you did in your doctoral program. But let's, if we can, yes, certainly focus for a few minutes on the introduction. I don't have the book, I just have the PDF, but that was good enough. And that is, you began to say, well, something isn't the same. As an individual who's worked with Young Life over the years, I know what it's like when you bring in that next crop of young people into a meeting. And after a while, you start asking the question, am I effective anymore? And that was a question you were asking.
Oh, I was looking around the room, and I was starting to doubt whether or not I was relevant anymore. I thought, I was turning 40. Maybe I'd gotten too old to work with adolescents because the messages I was sharing wasn't landing very well. I just was seeing a lot of panic attacks, a lot of high anxiety, kids who didn't want to be in groups, and a lot of hostility to the gospel. And I really looked inward and said, there must be a problem with me.
But actually, after a little bit of digging, you said, no, I think there's a generational shift. And I have for many years, even as an individual that's much older than you even, began to speak on this issue of the Millennial Roundtable and millennials, in part because of books that are out by people that we've just mentioned a minute ago and others. And you began to say, what we're dealing with is another generation. And Generation Z is really now coming to full life in their 20s and further. And as a result, you began to recognize it wasn't you were changing or you were ineffective. It was the generation changing, wasn't it?
Yeah, they had come in so quickly, so fast, and caused such a sharp difference in what was happening in adolescent culture. I think they just caught us all on our heels. We didn't know what was going on. But once I was able to put my finger on it, then I knew I could start reading it, studying, talking, listening, and figure out what was really happening with this group of kids that were filling our middle schools, high school, colleges, and like you said, now they're in our workplaces.
And let's talk about church for just a minute, because in our booklet, each month we produce a booklet. One of my booklets is a biblical point of view on the next generation. I take on the myth, which I oftentimes refer to as the field of greens myth, because of the idea that if you build it, they will come. But the field of dreams myth is based on the assumption that they were always there. And the sad reality is that, as you point out early on, that the research shows that almost half, at least 4 in 10 Gen Zers, never attended religious services. So when we've had pastors tell us, well, we recognize that young people, when they graduate from high school, they leave the church for a while, but eventually they come back. The argument is kind of fallacious, because a lot of them were never in church in the first place.
Yeah, and even that last thing you said, the Pew Research came out with their report earlier this year on the religious landscape of the United States, and said that the unstickiness of faith is what is sticking with Gen Z as they get older. They're not returning. What's sticking right now is to walk away and stay walked away.
One of the other things that you surfaced there, and we've talked about this in our survey, that when they have asked Gen Z Christians, do you think the teachings of Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha and other religious systems are all equal? They say yes. And as a matter of fact, they recognize that, if anything, they want to reject the idea of what we call the exclusivity of the gospel. So there you are, Tanita, talking about John 14:6. Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And I think right off the bat, they're thinking, well, that sounds pretty exclusive. What's that all about? And it does seem to me that that's another example of where some of these cultural messages have made their way into this generation.
Absolutely. And I think one of the examples I like to use when I'm talking with young people is they're working under the assumption that there are multiple paths to God. There's multiple ways to heaven. And there's this scene in one of the Avengers movies that has all the possible outcomes that could happen. How many outcomes are there? And as Dr. Strange is in his own little space, he says, there's 14 million ways. Over 14 million ways this can go. And the second question is, how many do we win? And he says, one. And I love to use that to say, hey, there might be 14 million roads out there. There's actually only one. You're assuming that there are multiple ways, but what if there was no way, and then God made a way out of where there was no way that existed?
Great illustration. One of the other issues I thought I'd put on the table before I work through some of those 7 questions is the fact that some people, we think, if they're Generation Y or Generation Z, they're really hostile to Christianity. But I think it's probably more accurate, Tanita, to say they're really apathetic about that, because, as you point out also in the introduction, according to Pew Research, it's not that they've just lost interest in Christianity, but they really have lost interest in any kind of religion, because they might come back and say, well, I'm kind of spiritual but not religious. I have some kind of spiritual issues, but I'm really not interested in getting involved in any kind of formal religion.
It's true. Faith in any belief system has dropped, and we live in a hyper-individualized society, which allows or gives permission for young people to think that they can create whatever belief system they want to based on their own preference, their own ideals, what they like. And so then conscribing to any kind of belief system would put a limitation on that. And so they've become resistant to those systems.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of these questions. There's 7 questions. You might want to number 1 to 7 and write them down. But again, book coming out shortly, and I would highly recommend it. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
President Trump has been promoting the positive impact of his tariffs while his critics argue that ultimately Americans will be paying the price for his tariffs. The editors of the Wall Street Journal point to inflation data to argue that American households will be paying. However, they acknowledge that an increase in consumer prices hasn't shown up yet, perhaps because companies have large cash reserves. Tim Carney argues that if you dig into the data, the question of who pays the tariffs becomes more complicated. If Walmart buys 100 rubber footballs from China, Walmart will pay Customs and Border Patrol. You would assume they would pass the increased cost on to their consumers. But China may not be the only source of footballs. There might be U.S. and Mexican football factories. If China is the only country making these footballs, the demand is what economists call inelastic. But if there are other sources of footballs, then demand is elastic. There's also the political component. President Trump told Walmart to eat the tariffs. It is likely that they indeed might have done this in many cases. After all, if you increase the cost of rubber footballs too much, consumers might decide to buy American-made leather footballs, or U.S. consumers might decide to keep throwing their old rubber football a little longer. On the positive side, tariff threats have changed the markets in ways that have helped consumers and encouraged U.S. investment in this country. But making rubber footballs in the U.S. will always be more expensive than making them in China. On the negative side, tariffs can trigger trade wars, and we've seen retaliation and other economic threats. As you can see, who pays the tariffs is more complicated than you might imagine. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of intelligent design, go to viewpoints.info/intelligent design. Viewpoints.info/intelligent design. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Tanita Maddox. The book is entitled What Gen Z Really Wants to Know About God. And I thought, Tanita, before we get to some of those questions, there's a good illustration that you use early on about generational disconnect. And you were taking a course from David Livermore, author of the book Cultural Intelligence. And he asked an interesting question of the class. Why did the prodigal son go hungry? That's in Luke 15. And it's interesting that generations answer that question differently. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. When he answered that question, or asked that question in class, my initial response was, oh, because he spent all of his money. And as he unpacked that passage, he said, there's three reasons in Scripture, but depending on where your values lie, what your culture is designed to answer, you may answer that question differently. So I, as a Gen Xer, might say, well, he went hungry because he spent all his money. But then our young people who maybe are a little more communally oriented, they're looking at social justice, they may say, well, because no one gave him anything to eat. Now, both those answers are in there, as well as a famine. But when we're looking at that question, we are guided by our cultural lens and our generational lens in how we answer it.
Well, that's an important issue. And so just for a minute, talk about who is Generation Z, and then I want to get into the 7 questions that run through your book. But for anybody that's trying to kind of peg them and put them in the right place, help us out.
Well, the most widely accepted birth years for Generation Z are 1997 to 2012. They're often described as digital natives because they had access to smart and interactive technology from a very young age. So they're very comfortable in that digital space. They speak that language. very, very well. I don't think it'll surprise anyone to hear that when Gen Z came on the scene, we saw a high rise in mental health issues, anxiety, depression, self-harm. They were identified as the loneliest generation in the United States, but also globally, loneliness has risen with this generation. And that brings me to the next thing, that Gen Z is our first real, true global generation. So that term is used across the world, and they were seeing a lot of the same characteristics of Gen Z in different places of the world as well as here.
So again, just a good illustration. That's one of the chapters. But let's, if we can, kind of see if we can unpack those 7 questions, because that is a very significant part of your book. Is God good? Am I enough? Will you accept me? Do all people matter to God? Can I trust you? What is true, and am I safe? You know, that first question, is God good, is something we talk about sometimes here on Point of View, because we do illustrate the issue of apologetics. We talk about that with different people that are articulating how to defend the biblical ideas. But one of the things I noticed early on is many of the individuals we've interviewed that do apologetics say, I've noticed a shift from do I believe in the existence of God to do I believe that God is good? And that really is your first question, isn't it?
It is. It's the heart of what so many people and young people are struggling with. And they won't phrase it like that. It usually comes in a bunch of why questions, like why would God let this happen? Why would God do this?
So talk about what that means in terms of what you've addressed there at Young Life, because that is sometimes a question anybody asks, but there's something unique about the way Gen Z asks that question, isn't there?
Well, what's interesting about their perspective is, again, because they come from that hyper-individualized place, they see themselves as a judge of everything that is good and then want to run God through their filter to decide whether or not God is good. But I'm actually really encouraged by them asking this question, because it assumes underneath the surface, way, way deep under the surface, that they think God should be good. If they didn't ask that question, if there were no why questions, and they just assumed God was bad, then they would assume all the things that would happen are bad. But I think the fact that they're answering this actually does show a hopeful perspective, that they understand that at the core of who God is good. And his goodness isn't necessarily preventing bad things from happening or hard things from happening. But what we see in the life of Jesus Christ is that his goodness is that he is with us. He's with people in the things that they are navigating.
It does seem to me that some of that gets back to a very important issue of maybe having the wrong definition of who God is. We just had somebody on the other day that wrote a book called Not My Jesus. We have people that have a very inaccurate view of who Jesus is, but it does come back to Christian Smith, who we interviewed years ago, in which he said we have a generation back then, that was 20 years ago, so those would be your peers now, who believed in moralistic therapeutic deism. If you get into that idea of deism, sometimes for Generation Y and Generation Z, God is out there, but he's not close. He's distant. He may have started the universe, but he's not involved in the day-to-day aspect of my life. And that's another reason why they may be asking the question, is God good?
Yeah, if he's disconnected from what's going on, he may not care what's happening in my life. And that does make that goodness of God something to doubt in. But when you start to look at things like he wept with mourners at the tomb of Lazarus, he was with the disciples in the boat in a storm, and actually next to criminals on a cross, and he's with them in all these places. He could have stopped any of these things from happening. He is God. And some people might think, well, that's what a good God would do. He would stop it. And what we see in the goodness of God is it's not stopping hard things. It's being with us in our experience side by side with God.
So that's the first one, is God good? Any one of these could be an entire program, but let's move on to the next one. Am I enough? And that gets back into anxiety, uncertainty, lack of confidence. What have you found as you have studied this and also interacted with various students?
It is amazing how many times this question comes up in various circumstances and settings. And I want to add, there's a little, you could add two other words, at the end of this, of am I enough to be loved or valued? That's what it is. And I think this is one of the most misunderstood questions by the church, because we may automatically default to a lens of righteousness and holiness. Like, am I, as a sinful person, enough for a holy God? But that is not the lens that they are asking it through. And so if we assume we know what they're asking, we can offer a very wrong answer to their question. Instead, if they're saying, but does God love me? And to be able to say, hey, God decided that you were enough before the beginning of time to make a plan for it to be possible for you to be with him. He decided that. He decided you were valuable. He decided you were loved so that he would make a way for you to be with him. And that's what they're looking for, because they are in a world that is constantly watching and measuring them in likes and comments and follows and accolades and failures. Everything's on a scale for them. So they are looking around going, but when will I be enough for you to love me and to think I'm valuable?
One of the things I wanted to mention just before we take a break is that we also have a link to your website. And if you click on the resources, one of the presentations if you have done is Am I Enough? Answering Gen Z, because it does seem to me that is, as you pointed out, a very significant issue. And people can watch you teach for about 23 minutes and get a sense of how you can begin to reach out to those individuals and maybe, first of all, understand, as you just pointed out a minute ago, the fact that their question to our ears is not something that we understand. We need to understand it from their perspective, don't we?
Absolutely. That's the key to all of this. And I think just cultural apologetics and missiology in general, we have to understand the people we're talking to so we can speak their language.
Well, we need to take a break. And when we come back, we have only talked about two of those. Is God good? Am I enough? The next one, of course, is going to be very obvious. Will you accept me? Because that's the other flip side of that. And that will be one that we'll get to. And then we'll talk about, do all people matter to God? Can I trust you? What is safe? Am I safe? And then we'll get into some of the other things, what now and how to get started. But again, as I mentioned, we have a link to her website, Tanita Maddox, and you can simply go to the website, tanitamaddox.com. But if you don't know how to spell that, it's okay, because we have that link there on the website. Then you can see more about the book as it's coming out and some of the free resources and get to know her a little bit better in case you'd like to have her come and speak on her book, or maybe give you some advice as you are reaching out to young people in your community. Again, the book is entitled What Gen Z Really Wants to Know About God. We've worked our way through just 2 of those 7 questions. We'll get through the rest of them before the end of the program. And if you would like to get that book, you could pre-order it. It's coming out soon, and I think you would benefit from that, especially if you're trying to reach out to the next generation. Don't forget, we also, of course, have our Next Generation Roundtable right here at Point of View, and that's one of the reasons why we make it available, so you can understand how to reach out to the next generation and build the church. We'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Tanita Maddox. And again, the book is entitled What Gen Z Really Wants to Know About God. We've talked about, is God good? Am I enough? Will you accept me? Is the next one. And that is a key issue because oftentimes Gen Z says, you don't seem to be accepting people that are LGBTQ. I saw how you looked askance at people that had nose piercing or tattoos. So are you really going to accept me is a question they're asking, isn't it?
Yeah, acceptance is a very, very high value for Gen Z, very, very core for them. They view themselves as traditionally more accepting of those who've been traditionally marginalized or outcast in society, and so they've really held on to that value tightly.
It does seem to me that one of the things we can do is, this is, again, one of the techniques we talk about so often, the value and the importance of asking questions. First of all, Jesus asked more questions than he answered, so I think we have a great model there. But when they say acceptance, it would be helpful to say, what do you mean by acceptance? This is one of the ones I refer to as the Princess Bride myth. You keep using that word, but I don't think it means what you think it means, because oftentimes they've said acceptance means I've got to affirm you in everything that you do, every part of your lifestyle. I can accept you as a person, even though we may disagree about morality or about lifestyle. And so I think the key sometimes, and you talk about this in the end part of your chapter, is to really have them explain what they mean by acceptance, and maybe help them to see that you can be accepting of an individual but not necessarily agree with everything that that individual says or does.
So for so much of their generational definition of acceptance, it's like what you said. Acceptance means agreement. They grew up in a very polarized time, and they don't see interactions of people disagreeing with one another and then being in a respectful relationship or having respectful dialogue. And so they're thinking, if you don't agree with me, you must reject me because you reject what I think or my views on things. And it goes along with acceptance going hand in hand with never asking me to change. You accept me for who I am, right? Is how it might be verbalized. And then we say that as if we are a character, like we're fixed. You cannot change who we are. And you asking me to change would be a fault with you. You don't accept me as I am. But really, I think when we look at Scripture, we see constantly Jesus both accepts people where they are and then changes them. I mean, thank the Lord, he's done that in my own life. He's accepted me where I was at any given moment and then continued to change me.
And again, that's one of those values. And of course, in every one of these, when you're dealing with somebody in another culture, as you get into an airplane and fly to a third world country, you expect that they're going to maybe perceive the world differently. So oftentimes it's important to ask questions and maybe make sure we're even working off of the same set of definitions. And the mistake we make here is when we have a different generation, we think they're all like us, and that's the mistake. And that's a place where I think just asking questions is very important. So, is God good? Am I enough? Will you accept me? Do all people matter to God? This is a generation that has probably been affected more by social justice. We're talking about death of George Floyd, the pandemic, the lockdown. We've talked about social media, social justice demonstrations, police reform. The list goes on and on. So in some respects, they wonder, do all people matter to God and really even matter to you, or are we going to once again find ourselves marginalized? Is that fair?
That is fair. And that's gone hand in hand with their consumption of media that has highlighted where powerful, influential people and institutions in the past have used that power and influence to harm. So that is the message that they were receiving as they were coming of age. Like you said, those 2020 incidents, that's all in the heart of their development. And then you start to look at God and go, God, do you see what's happening? Do you care about this? Do you care about these people over here and these people over here? And what's different about them than me growing up is I wanted to know that God cared about me. And what's really impressive with young people is they're looking around also, and they'll start to say, wait, it doesn't matter if God cares about me. If he doesn't care about these other people, I don't want anything to do with that God. And so they're really focused on this community and seeing, where does God care about other people? Or the bigger question might even be, does God only care about certain people? And so we get to open the gospel and show how God really does see all kinds of people, that he is caring and these things matter to him, and he has a plan for restoration and setting things right, that he has a plan for justice.
Well, another one of those issues that relates, number 5, is can I trust you? And it's interesting that a couple of times you ask individuals that were Gen Z, well, how do you know you can trust someone? And they'd say, well, because I've known them for a long time, or I kind of see how they act with other individuals. I really need to know that they care. And of course, we've used the old trite cliche, they don't really care what you know until they know that you care. But that's a big issue, perhaps bigger for this generation than previous generations, wouldn't you say?
Well, I don't know about you, but I grew up being taught to respect my elders. And part of that was you trusted what your elders had to say. But for our young people, again, they've grown up in that social media world. They are hyper aware of the fact that people can lie about who they are online, that they can curate their feed and edit pictures and only present certain things about who they are. And so their default is, I won't trust you until you prove you can trust. They actually have a very, very high value for their trust. It's not cheap. They're not going to give it away. They want to know that we are worthy of that trust before they give it away to us, because of the world they've grown up with has taught them that generally you should not trust others.
Well, and again, this is a generation that has been sold. And if you are always, in a sense, feeling like you're a target for a sales pitch, then when an individual with young life comes and says, well, I want to tell you about Jesus, like, okay, well, here we go again. There's this real sense in which that their barriers, their emotional barriers, their skepticism is a little bit higher than, say, for previous generations. And that's where this issue of trust comes in, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And, I was talking with Kara Powell of the Florida Youth Institute, and she says, we as a church, we've earned that distrust, and we've got to work and be patient to earn it back with our young people.
Well, let's see if we can get to another one. What is true? And that gets into truth as a weapon and what you can trust and what is true in a generation that really does not believe that there are things that are absolutely true and absolutely false. It is more difficult than ever because of kind of pluralism, multiculturalism, postmodernism. Those are a lot of big issue words there, but nevertheless, that is the generation that certainly doesn't necessarily believe in truth, and they oftentimes will say, well, Tanita, I appreciate your truth. That's your truth, but it's not my truth. And that's really one of the greatest challenges for evangelism today, I would think.
Sure is. I mean, we've all heard that my truth, your truth, and I think even you were referring to some other resources talking about my Jesus, your Jesus, my picture of God. That's not what my God does. And so truth has been really captured in this individualized lens. And part of it is because our generation actually has a very complicated relationship with truth. Gen Z has seen truth be used as a weapon to hurt people, to exclude people. And because of those other values of acceptance being really high, there's a fear of, if I say this is true and this person doesn't agree with it, am I cutting them out? Like, am I saying that relationally I don't accept them, I reject them because I say that this thing is true over here? And what is really sad is that they're trying to navigate the world and do what is right, like fight for social justice and stand up for acceptance. But we as a society have removed that compass of truth from them and said, well, you have to figure it out on your own here. And when I sit with a young person, I say, I can't imagine what it's like to be you, and try to figure out what the right thing to do is, what the wrong thing to do is, what is good, what is evil, and have absolutely no compass for doing that. And you can watch their shoulders just relax for a second and go, someone sees how hard this is for me. And so they have a complicated relationship with truth. And we just have to understand that when we enter into that conversation, and help them also see that truth exists outside of their personal experiences and how they're relating to the world.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into one more. Of course, we just talked about what is true, am I safe? And, of course, we've talked that of before, even going back many years ago when we had Jonathan Haidt on talking about the coddling of the American mind, and talked about this emphasis on safetyism and safe spaces and trigger warnings and many, many other issues. So we'll get into that. And then finally, there is a whole set of chapters on what now and how to get started. So this is all part of the book, What Gen Z really wants to know about God. If you'd like to know more about what Tanita Maddox is doing, we have a link to her website. We have information about her social media. Information is there as well if you'd like to find it. And we will take a break and continue our conversation with her right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
What Gen Z really wants to know about God, 7 questions about life and faith. The 7th one is, am I safe? And you use the illustration from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, in which Susan asks of Aslan, who is the God figure in the story, if Aslan is safe. And Mr. Beaver's answer is, who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good, which really cycles back to the first one. Is God good? And I think it's important to recognize that safetyism is an issue for this generation, and as a result, it's worth addressing. But at the same time, it really brings us back to, is God good, which was the first of the questions, wasn't it?
It is, and I think sometimes we can use that quote as a mic drop as the end of the conversation, so you don't have to worry about this. He's not safe, but he's good. But for Gen Z, those things are tied together. So we maybe think we answered the question, but we have really actually introduced something very hard for our young people to wrestle with, because they're like, hold on, if he's not safe, he can't be good. And if he's not good, he can't be safe. Those things go hand in hand. And actually, for both of those chapters, I go back and say, those definitions, what is good and what is safe, actually should be defined through God, not through us, and then trying to decipher whether or not God are those things.
Well, let's talk about what we can do with all of this. First of all, you have a worksheet for reading the Bible with a Gen Z lens. We've already mentioned all of those, but again, for people that have been taking some notes, and I know a lot of people do, is God good? Am I enough? Will you accept me? Do all people matter to God? Can I trust you? What is true, and am I safe? And then to begin to think about which questions are certainly addressed in Scripture and how to maybe address those, because that's going to help us maybe reach out to this generation. And for a youth leader right now, this is great material for him or her. For parents who are raising the Gen Z, or even grandparents who have Gen Z grandchildren, it does seem to me that that gives us a chance to kind of look at the world through their worldview, doesn't it?
It's just so cool that the Bible addresses every culture, every people group around the world, throughout history, that this is not something new, that the Bible's been around for a long time and has met each culture where they're at. And so it makes me so excited that, of course, God would address the questions that Gen Z has in his scripture.
Do you think discipleship for this generation is maybe a little different, or needs to be a little different than the standard, almost cookie-cutter ways that have been presented by Cru or Navigators or Young Life or Baptist Student Union?
Well, what all those ministries have in common that I really appreciate is that they're modeled after life-on-life ministry that Jesus did. Our kids don't want to be a program. Gen Z does not want a worksheet and a workbook and a program and a set mentor schedule. They want real, authentic life. They want to come over to your house and have a meal, or sit on the couch and watch the game, or do yard work alongside you, go to the grocery store. They want to do real everyday life and see how your faith is actually being lived out in the everyday ways. Like, how does God actually touch every part of your life?
So again, one of the things that you recommend is that this book isn't out, but when it is out, you could read the book together, and that would be at least one way to begin to talk about this, don't you think?
I do this all the time with the Gen Zers in my life. Every time I read a piece of information or article, I say, this is what they're saying about you. What do you say? And then give them the platform to share their life with me. And it has been the most fruitful conversations. And part of it is when you pick up this book and you invite a Gen Zer to read it with you, you're saying to that person, you are important enough and valuable enough. I respect you enough to hear what you have to say about this.
Let's talk about some of your resources. One of those is you have a YouTube series of the Gospel of John with the eyes of Gen Z. So it does seem to me that that is a video that you could watch, or maybe even a video that you two could watch together or separately and come together for discussion. So it does seem to me that that might be a very effective resource. And how have you used that in the past?
I've used it in conversations with our young people, and I've actually talked to some other staff who've used it with their young people. And both the conversation on both sides of a young person saying, I didn't know that God actually talked about these things in the Bible, and the other, their staff person, their leader saying, I didn't know that these things were important to you, and them really then wrestling with, well, do we agree with the way Tanita presented it? How do you see it reflected in Scripture? And so it's provided more of a spark for conversation. It's not meant to define all the answers to John or in John, but it is meant to spark a conversation with young people to see how they can look in the Scriptures and find the answers to the things they're looking for.
One of the other things you have is a table for a proclamation on Gen Z values. So there's some great, what you call the table tool. And talk about how to use that, because some of that's implied in the book. But again, people can, even before the book comes out, go to your website, which we again have a link to, and find out some of that information and begin right away to think about how to make these kinds of presentations.
I use this all the time. I actually have it printed out and next to my Bible when I'm reading the Bible, and I look at a passage and say, how does it answer these questions? Which questions does it address? And I look for those things in the Scriptures. And what's beautiful about God's Word is that when I started looking for these questions as I was reading passages, I saw things I had never seen before. The Holy Spirit revealed things that I had never seen before. And so now when I open these passages and I prepare to speak with kids, I can specifically look for those questions and how they're layered and how God addresses them, and address that in my message using their terminology or Gen Zers' words or Gen Zers' values to be able to talk about the gospel with them in a way that makes sense in their worldview.
One of the things we talk about here on Point of View is apologetics. You heard me mention that before, but you also have kind of a 12-minute sample of what apologetics could be used for with the Gen Z generation. And so that's another resource that's available on your website as well, isn't it?
It is, and Rebecca McLaughlin says that cultural apologetics is a version of neighbor love. It's saying, I love you enough to understand your world, and I love God enough to be able to figure out how to share God in your world lens. And so I spend a lot of time and work. That's what I do, is figure out how do I love the next generation well enough to understand them so I can share God in a way that makes sense to them.
Been talking about the book, What Gen Z Really Wants to Know About God. Tanita Maddox with us, and if you would like to contact her, we have that information on the website. If you'd like to know about the resources, that is the case. And if you'd like to pre-order the book, it is available on our website at pointofview.net. Tanita, thank you for joining us, and look forward to a future opportunity.
What a joy to be with you and all your listeners.
I think especially since we have that next gen roundtable, she would be an excellent participant in that as well. One last time, again, 7 questions. Is God good? Am I enough? Will you accept me? Do all people matter to God? Can I trust you? What is true? And am I safe? These questions are actually chapters in her book. There's 10 chapters and all sorts of great material. As I pointed to, not only the book, but her website, some great resources that you could begin to use immediately. And when the book comes out, I would certainly recommend it to you. If you are a youth leader, I don't imagine how you couldn't value some of the material in that book. If you're a parent or a grandparent trying to understand this generation, well, that's one of the reasons why we've talked about it today here on Point of View. All that available at the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to listen to this again or watch it, or would like to pass it on to others, click on that button that says Watch or Listen. And then, of course, you can find out about it by looking at the various shows that have been posted on the website. You can find it on our website, find it on Facebook, find it on YouTube. And so take the time to learn about how to reach out to Gen Z, because, again, this is a generation that we want to reach out to. We want to equip you to make a difference reaching out to them as well. Great conversation, and you've been listening to Point of View.
Let me ask you something, if I may. Have you been blessed by Point of View? We often hear from listeners about the positive impact that Point of View has in their lives. As one listener told us, Point of View leaves me informed and encouraged. So this may surprise you. Out of all the Point of View's hundreds of thousands of listeners, just 1% supports the program. And yet Point of View relies on listener donations. If every listener gave just $10, Point of View's full ministry and operations would be funded for an entire year. Let me ask you again, have you been blessed by Point of View? I urge you, pay it forward today with a $10 donation so others may be blessed as well. Give online at pointofview.net. Or you can call us and give toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.